Hi, I'm Jenna Moore. I'm the curator of Annelida at the LAB. Annelids are segmented worms, so they include earthworms, leeches, and their relatives in the sea. When I was younger, I didn't expect to be able to attend university. And once I realized that I could get scholarships and actually go to university, I thought, well, I'm interested in biology. Maybe I'll become a physician or a medical doctor. And then as soon as I started taking zoology courses, I realized very quickly that there was so much I didn't know. And there's so much diversity I had never even heard of in, my late teens and early 20s. So I quickly became hooked on zoology. And then through taking a marine invertebrate course, and then through participating in an expedition in French Polynesia, I ended up becoming very interested in annelids. During that expedition, there were really famous worm researchers, and they showed me amazing things and amazing diversity. And so I ended up doing my PhD on annelids because of that experience, largely. And the other thing I was really interested in was museum collections. So I began working and volunteering in museum collections in 2008. And I continued to do that throughout my studies and my PhD and everything until now. My research focuses on three main themes. The first of them is the evolutionary relationships between different worm species, and we call this phylogenetics. And this study informs another branch of my research, which is the evolution of form and function in annelids. So annelids have very diverse body plans and many different structures on their bodies that have many different functions as well. So understanding how these structures have evolved through time is a really interesting part of my research, and I would say my main focus. A third aspect is the discovery and description of biodiversity, and especially annelid biodiversity. So this involves systematics, which is the classification of worm species, and taxonomy, which is the description of new species. Another important aspect of this is biodiversity discovery itself, and through this we do fieldwork expeditions and collect species from all around the world, largely in marine environments. And the reason for collecting species from so many different places is that you can compare their distributions and you can see across the global ocean how species are distributed and how it relates to environmental things like temperature or currents or things like this. And so it gives you a better idea of how biodiversity is distributed on Earth. So most of my research can be considered basic research, meaning I'm trying to figure out how many species are there, how these species are distributed across the planet, and how their diversity has evolved. And basic research is contrasting with applied research. So applied research is something like conservation or protecting species. And if you don't know what species there are and how they're distributed, it's impossible to protect them. And right now we're experiencing a human-driven extinction crisis on Earth, where entire habitats are being destroyed. And so if we don't understand what species are there before they're lost forever, before those habitats are destroyed, then we have no chance of understanding Earth's biodiversity over many time scales and spatial scales. So in a museum collection, what we're trying to do is preserve a record of biodiversity and where it comes from. So we have specimens from a certain place, and we can use these specimens to trace how patterns of biodiversity change through time, how they change over space, and correlate this with environmental variables and things like climate change, which is human-driven. So if we can link these two things, we can understand how extinction happens and do our best to prevent it with using these techniques. I think that people often make the mistake of characterizing biodiversity as important to people or not important to people. People are one species, and we're talking about millions of species. and they have equal value to humans. And I think it's easy to miss that when we live in this human realm. We go to the grocery store and we drive cars and we do all sorts of silly things for a primate to do. But in reality, diversity has value inherently. It has its own inherent value, whether or not we're observing it or not. And so it's important to remember when you think about, oh, well, worms, we don't eat them, we don't, use them as farm animals, we don't do anything strange with worms that has a direct relationship to our own lives. But they're important parts of the ecosystems in which they live, and they've been evolving on planet Earth for 550 million years. So they were here first. I think we should respect them. I think the biggest challenge to being a scientist is how many different things we have to be to do science well. So we have to, of course, be scientists and experts in our research. We have to be graphic designers. We have to be legal experts. We have to be public speakers. We have to be teachers. We have to be administrators. Many, many, many different aspects go into being a scientist that I didn't know before I started. And sometimes this can be very challenging. And the other thing that can be challenging is balancing all of our different responsibilities. So aside from research, we also have responsibilities in curation, of course, in the museum collections. And we have responsibilities to do service to the scientific community, like reviewing papers and editing papers and things like this. So sometimes balancing those aspects and finding the time to really dig into your research project can be a little bit difficult. I think the advice I would give to young researchers is to really explore early on many different aspects of something you're interested in and discover what you're really passionate about. When I first started, there's no way I would have predicted that I would become a worm curator. I mean, I didn't even think this was a job, but it turns out that it's actually my dream job and a really good fit for me. So it's important to explore your passions and not be afraid to specialize, because I started out really digging into worm curation, and here I am now with this position that is just a perfect fit. So it can be a little bit scary to narrow your options, but it can also pay off in really interesting ways. And the other thing I would tell a young researcher is never be afraid to say, I don't know, because I think it's the smartest thing a scientist can ever say, and especially if you follow it up with, let's find out. I think the most exciting part of doing research is the element of discovery. Sometimes you find a new species or a new pattern or a new result, and you just think, I'm the only person in the world who knows this right now. And so that aspect is really cool, because what we're doing is creating knowledge. That's what scientists do. They create knowledge, and then the knowledge is used in different ways by students and other people doing research and things like that. So I think that's probably the coolest part of doing research. So another really interesting part of working in science is being able to interact with lots of different researchers and doing collaborations with people who have a different perspective. And this includes international groups of collaborators, or even just people who think about your research topic in a different way. This can be really, really fruitful. And for example, in Germany, there are extremely talented morphologists who study the form of annelid body plans in great detail. And collaborating with them means that I can have a more thorough perspective on the morphology of the animals, the body plans of these animals, and integrate my interest in function with that interest. So you can really find these dynamic groups of researchers to work together really well and to make the impact of the research better in the end.